You know, for me, if art needs to be about healing, especially today. So I was deeply touched by that film. I'm struck that what Lonnie spoke about earlier, what Richard spoke about, this film, they're all held in the talk that I'm going to be giving. My sense is this is a conference where we get to meet in very special ways. So let's begin. The universe is a continuous web. Touch it at any point, and the whole web quivers. Stanley Kunitz. I shall talk about the web out of which my art grows. Some of my words and ideas will resonate with you. Pay attention to those that do. Inspiration might live in that place. That is where you can feel the web quivering. It is a good place to stand. The word transformations is pregnant with change. For me, it has often reflected the power of the image to heal. Transformations speak of birth, of source, and source can be a spring from which a river might eventually flow. Other artists have been sources for me. The integrity of their visions, expressed in their unique visual language, influences my work. Not superficially. My work doesn't look like theirs, but profoundly. They teach me to see and think in new ways, to deepen my own vision. I believe as artists, we are here to inspire each other to go deeper into our visions. I return to their art as I would to a spring, to drink the pure water. It is important to know which artist shoulders we stand on, and not just artists in our own discipline, though that's important too. And I want to share with you some of the artists who are part of my heritage. To me, this is the best art ever done. And it's the most essential art ever made. It is our source. We were still connected to nature in a different way then. David Smith, the sculptor, who lived in till the middle of the last century, wrote this. This is one of his last pieces, his cubies. I'm always intrigued by how artists mature during their life. David Smith wrote, "As artists, we should not stretch to invent, but we should feel what has gone before us and know what has been found. And what has been found is heritage. And what are problems?" He uses the word problems. He lived during the Second World War. I think of them as questions. So I'm going to substitute my word here. And what are questions are the things we are to find. The seeing of things from our vantage point, which is a place no artist has stood before. And this is a place not of invention in the narrow sense, but passionately found visions. Because those visions hold the inspired answers to the questions of who we are in the time we are placed to speak. After having a heart attack, Barnett Newman worked from 1958 to 1966 on the 14 paintings based on Jesus' cry from the cross, Lama Sabachthani. "O Lord, why hast thou forsaken me?" Now, of course, Newman was Jewish, and he was deeply schooled in his Judaism. But this was the cry that came to him. You can feel the artist experiencing his own transformation as he worked. This art, to me, is essential, like the cave painting art. I don't use the word abstract for art. That is the word that was useful for a period. I don't think it holds anymore. He was part of the abstract expressionists. That's the school, supposedly, that he lived in. What's important to me in art is not whether it's realistic, not whether it's abstract, not whether it's narrative. It's whether it goes to the essence always to the essence. And when you are in Washington, D.C., please go to the National Gallery and spend time with the 14 Stations of the Cross. Because to me, it's some of the most essential painting of the last century. And I come from a painting discipline. I actually come from working with lots of materials. But for the last many years, I used a lot of paint. This is Philip Guston's work. He's one of my source people. And he painted in, this manner for many, many years. He was also called an abstract expressionist. What he wrote when he was painting like this was, the desire for direct expression became so strong that even the interval necessary to reach back to the palette beside me became too long. I forced myself to paint the entire work without stepping back to look at it once. And then his style changed, and it became this. I'm sorry about the pixelation, but please look up Philip. I think he's, again, one of the great painters of the last century. And he painted Ku Klux Klan figures with cigars poking out of their mouths, these very cartoonish. Now, this is a man who could paint things as realistically as anyone that I've ever seen. During his WPA days, that's what he did. And his style changed, and his work stopped selling. And the last 20 years of his life, one of my collectors happened to support him for that entire time, buying his work. And then the 27 pieces that Ed Broida bought are now at MoMA. Marcel Duchamp is a deep influence on my work. If you don't know who these people are, please look up their work, read about them. I think it's very important that we know about other disciplines than our own. Duchamp was a deeply intellectual artist. He worked in many different media, including glass. When the large glass, as it's called, broke in transport, he found it much more interesting, and there's been a lot of talk about breaking, including in the short film. And for him, it became a stronger piece in the breaking. On the right is a piece on which he worked secretly for 20 years. The last 20 years of his life, this magnificent artist, everybody thought all he was doing was playing chess. And in fact, at night, he was secretly working on a piece. This piece, and here's a photograph of people looking at it, is in the Philadelphia Art Museum, a very large room you walk into. You read on the wall the caption about what the piece is, Été donné, the gas lamp, and the waterfall. And then you look around and you figure it's probably being repaired or something, and you walk out. He worked on it for 20 years. If you stay in the room and your eyes adjust, you'll see two tiny holes with light coming out of them. You walk up to these doors and you press your nose against it, where everybody else who's realized there's something there presses their nose. So there's a certain human smell to it, and you'll see an entire scene. I won't describe it, it can't be photographed. I thought this was brilliant. When I was last at the Philadelphia Art Museum, there was a guard telling everybody, no, you have to go and look through those holes. And I tried to explain to him, no, Duchamp's work was about what is art, what isn't art, what is seen, what isn't seen. And this is a brilliant way that he chose to explore it. Omri Matisse wrote in 1939, I work without theory. I am conscious only of the forces I use, and I am driven by an idea I really only grasp as it grows with the picture. During the last 20 years of last probably 10 years of his life, he worked on the cutouts, and this is Daedalus. This is Icarus falling, is one of his cutouts from his book Jazz. I'm deeply moved by artists who find a form in the last part of their life. Since I'm 76, I hope to live as long as my mother did, to 95. And I am only now beginning to find a form, in part because of my working in glass, that can synthesize in a profound way what I have explored for 50 years. So these people are models, and we need not only to know our heritage, but to have models for how we work. This is not an individual artist. These are the Dogon people of Africa, of Mali. When I was 19, I was at Berkeley studying English literature, and of course I was late for class. I was always late. So I was dashing across campus, and I cut through Crower Hall, and there was a weaving, a black and white weaving, very thin, and it stopped me in my tracks. I almost didn't make it to class. And it was by a Dogon Weaver. And I decided, it simply took my heart away. I had no idea I was an artist at that point. And ever since then, I have sought their work at the Musée de l'Homme in Paris, wherever the Dogon work is. This particular piece is in the Michael Rockefeller collection at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and unfortunately it's in storage now, because I would always go back to visit it when I was anywhere near New York. This piece is in my studio, and it's a Dogon ladder. And what I love about their work, it's about the material. This is from the 1930s. Beside it, what I have is a typewriter from the 1930s, the kind that was used to make lists of people during the Second World War in Germany. And I keep them next to each other to remind me about materials that get removed from what they were and materials that stay and extend what they are, because there's no question this ladder is this, as well as being the tree itself. So back to transformation. A particular type of transformation, metamorphosis, needs to lie at the center of visions of our time. Ego does not drive metamorphosis. It is an organic process of transformation. It has its own life. As one form changes into another, much larger forces, internal and external, turn a caterpillar into a butterfly. Much larger forces give us access to our own unconscious as we transform through our art. Doing art has transformed me, letting me explore the shadowed aspects of my own and our cultural unconscious. The word metamorphosis connects us to glass, an amorphous solid. Metamorphosis and amorphous share a common etymological ancestor. Morpheus. Morpheus is the son of sleep, and he's also the bringer of dreams and the maker of shapes. For me, he's the artist's guardian, and because his name is incorporated in amorphous, for glass artists in particular. During this talk, I shall share with you 2 collaborative residencies that took me to the heart of transformation and metamorphosis, to the heart of the creative process. But first, with Morpheus as our guiding spirit, let us recognize that transformation and metamorphosis happen in the spaces between. A conference like this is such a space, a designated time for each and all of us to reflect on our love of glass and this cocoon that Bullseye has created. So, we're going to do a little exercise. I want you to think, well, why don't you take out make sure you have your pen and our pencil and paper in front of you. Because this conference is about each of us and all of us together. Okay, so for the next 2 minutes, I want you to imagine what you would like to happen at BECon 2017, what transformation you want to experience. And write this as you're thinking about it. You can close your eyes and think about it for a while, and then simply write down what comes to you. What in this cocoon here that we're creating together, what would you like to happen inside you? Now what I'd like you to do is simply share your writing with your neighbor. You take 1 minute each. Just share very softly, speak softly with each other. If some of you don't have neighbors, move over and okay. I think we could spend the rest of the time doing this, but now we have another part of the exercise. Let's finish up the sharing because there's another section, and you can share more later with each other. I know. I really wish we could spend the next 20 minutes doing this because I think there's so much to discover in each other. Okay, now what I'd like you to do, please, and please continue the discussion when we're done. It was wonderful listening to your voices. I want you to think of one word that holds the entire cocoon for you. One word. Just to spin one word for yourself. And write that word down. Just let it come. You don't have to search for it. Just let that word come to you. And now when I count to 3, I've never done this before, by the way, so I had no idea what was going to happen, but it just seemed like the right exercise for Transformations, BECon 2017. So when I count to 3, just say that word. Say it in a whisper so that it can be in the air all around us, because language is so important. 1, 2, 3. Okay, now that's with us. And after my talk, perhaps you can share some of those words with each other. I'd like to know what they are. Thank you for doing that. So I shall speak about 2 collaborative residencies that that personify metamorphosis. To describe the first at Pilchuck in 2000, I shall use words and images from my book, Glass. When I think of glass, I think of fire as a living and essential collaborator. At Pilchuck, I worked with Karen Willenbrink Johnson as my brilliant gaffer to explore the dropping of the atomic bomb, the sun brought to Earth. On July 16th, 1945, at 5:29:21 a.m. Mountain Wartime. How many of you knew that we ever were on Mountain Wartime? I was 4 years old then, but I never had heard the term. Mountain Wartime, a nuclear fireball sucked the white sand of the Jornada del Muerto miles high into the still dark sky of New Mexico. The sand, transformed into molten glass, rained onto the desert. It wasn't formed on the desert floor as they thought it was. Recently it was discovered it was pulled up into the cloud and came down as rain. That's a powerful image, isn't it? One that hopefully some of you will work with in glass. I decide to explore the specters we released in New Mexico, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki. In my studio on the Hopi Reservation, where I live with my husband, Philip, not knowing why, I packed sheets of gold leaf to take with me. I had no idea. That's what I took from my studio. Sitting in the hot shop at Pilchuck, Karen and I discussed the dropping of the atomic bomb. I share one of my poems, De Harmonia Mundi. 15 billion years ago, our universe exploded into song. Electrons, quarks, neutrinos dance from plucked strings. Gravity, strong force, weak force, electromagnetism wove into 10 dimensions. An angel has 1,000 heads, each head 1,000 tongues, each tongue 1,000 voices, each voice 1,000 melodies. That's what the mystics whisper. Luminous words fall through time. I step through a cracked horizon. I'm not sure how to make this go up. Can I touch it? Nope. That's okay. I show Karen a photograph of the Trinity blast at 16 milliseconds. A man who died recently, I forget his name for the moment, had set up 50 cameras around the blast site. This is 1945, remember, and they sequentially went off. So this is 16 milliseconds, and you can see the sand starting to be pulled up, actually. I asked Karen to replicate the image in glass, and she does. Next, I ask her to blow a mushroom cloud, and it collapses into a broken skeletal head. The following day, feeling stuck in a literal intellectualized process, I share a black and white photograph from Robert Del Tredici's book, At Work in the Fields of the Bomb. This sphere represents the amount of plutonium used to destroy Nagasaki, 1 human handful. We decide to blow a 3-inch diameter sphere. After annealing it for 24 hours, we experience the physicality of holding a representation of the amount of plutonium it took to destroy Nagasaki. That night, I fall to sleep confused about how to go deeper into the process. The confusion, the uncertainty, the not knowing where to go next is so important. It's not comfortable, but it's essential. Metaphorically speaking, that is when Morpheus can guide us. As the sun rose, I walked from my cabin down the hill through dew-laden grass to my studio. For the past 4 days, I had passed the blackened stump of a lightning-struck tree. Today, I become fully conscious of it. In other words, the web quivered. Entering my studio, I pick up a white bowl. With my knife, I scrape carbon ash from the tree into the bowl. Holding it and the gold leaf I brought from Hopi, I walk to the hot shop. Sprinkling some of the ash on a steel table and placing a sheet of gold leaf over it, I ask Karen to roll molten glass across these materials. Moving her pipe in and out of the furnace, she blows a 3.5 diameter sphere. The carbon releases gas that hollows a cavity in the sphere. Ash floats in the cavity. The gold leaf dissolves. The thin walls of the sphere glow golden. We blow a second sphere with the same materials in the same way. This time, the gas creates a mushroom-shaped cloud. Ash floats in the cloud. The gold leaf forms continental shapes that encircle the cloud. An umbilicus of ash stretches from the bottom of the cloud to the base of the sphere. A crystallized semicircle suggests an atomic blast wind. To complete the trinity, we repeat the process. The ash forms a chrysalis, stretching from the top to bottom poles of the sphere. The gold partially encases the chrysalis. Now remember, we've done the same thing each time. Closing the door of the annealing oven, Karen and I stare incredulously. And if any of you know Karen's work, she can make anything in the world. She couldn't have made this, neither could I. Karen and I stare incredulously at one another. We ask, how did that happen? Silica sand, carbon ash, gold leaf, fire, breath, intention, and the unconscious combined alchemically to take us below political rationalizations into human suffering, and beyond that to the mystery of the creative destructive process itself. 7 years later, in 2007, I bring 4 1x6 by 6-inch steel slabs to my friend, artist Tom Joyce. Using fire and hydraulic pressure, Tom forges a dimple in each slab. This is the final piece on top, and slightly different views of the glass spheres below. I sold it to a collector who assured me she would eventually give it to a museum that would put it on permanent display. You know, as an artist, I know which pieces should be public and which ones are ones that are different than that. This piece, because of how it touched right into the heart of the most creative, destructive act in 1 second that America created, this bomb, that was the most creative act in one way and the most destructive, how it held all of that, and that this piece was able to hold that. Fortunately, this collector understood that, and she said that she would, in fact, it would only be on, if it would be on permanent display. It's not about me, it's about the piece. So, flash forward 17 years, and after my time with Bullseye 5 years ago and falling in love with this medium, I'm fortunate enough to have a collaborative residency with Michael Rogers. And here's Michael, being Michael. He's a wonderful artist, teacher, and collaborator. For 5 weeks in February and March, we worked together at Corning. We are both makers. Between us, we have over 100 years' experience of doing art. Yet we began our journey at Corning without preconceptions, and they were kind enough to let us take the journey. The word journey wandered into English during the 13th century. It meant the amount of travel in a day. Each day during our residency, Michael Rogers and I journeyed great distances, turning time into space as we entered Terra Incognita. Our intention was to pay attention to the unintentional. Within the continually enriching alchemical incubator of Corning, we explored change and decay, the universal and the infinite, new ways of defining beauty while capturing the experience of the dissolving moment. Sounds like glass. Ursula Le Guin wrote, "A true pilgrimage consists in coming home. We came to Corning as pilgrims. Working with glass is sacred to us. The raw material that becomes glass holds an interaction of wind, water, fire, and earth. The organic creative process lived over millions of years of geologic time. Glass exemplifies continual change and decay, growth and transformation. Held in the cocoon of the museum, the scientific community, the studio, and the Rakow Research Library, our collaboration was about transformation and coming home." With our materials budget, we ordered our supplies weeks before the residency from Bullseye. With no ideas about how we would use them, we decided to order black, white, and clear, different kinds of whites. Bullseye generously supplied us with 40-pound containers of Fritz and powders and 18 large sheets of glass. We began our process by paying attention to our surroundings, such as the burn marks on the hallway floors in the studios. Obviously, this hallway was originally part of a hot shop. These beautiful unintentional marks spoke its history. We toured the conservation laboratory at the museum with the head conservator, Stephen Koob, and met his staff, who worked with crazed, weeping, atmospherically deteriorating, and broken glass. We observed the changing landscape. As I walked across the bridge between the apartment and the campus each morning and evening, a ritual of perception of change grew. By the way, if I ask you which of these is more interesting, which would you say? The one over here or the one over here? Hands up for the one over here. Yeah. It's very interesting because this is very thought out. And perhaps it has some kind of meaning of... Jane, does it have any molecular meaning or anything? Okay, yes. And this is one of the snows. We are fortunate enough to have a blizzard. Each morning, Michael and I shared images, stories, or our dreams and our experiences. We often talked for a few hours. Sometimes students would join us. Jane would join us. Michael had been creating glass divining rods in his studio. So I shared this photograph of a drawing on the earth for the Dogon fox divining ritual that seeks for harmony and balance. A theme emerged within the synthesized scientific and artistic world of Corning, divination. The word divination comes from the Latin divinare, to be inspired by a god, which is what had happened when Karen and I were working. The act of divination organizes what appears to be random. A practitioner may use physical objects ritually to interpret the present and to predict future events. On our way to lunch was very important, and they have a great staff restaurant there. On our way to lunch one day, we saw a honey locust tree, fascinated by the thorns it creates to protect itself when under stress. We asked the tree if we could cut some. That felt proper. Ritual became part of our process. Michael had taught for many years in Japan. I had grown up in Los Angeles with many Japanese friends whose fathers were gardeners. We both knew before cutting down a tree in Japan, the person would ask permission. After lunch, we cut some thorns and took them back to our studio. Meanwhile, librarian Beth Hyland gave us a tour of the library and its magnificent archives. They've just announced, by the way, that they will give residencies to actually sit in the library and simply do research. I saw that on their site yesterday. We selected manuscripts from the 12th and 13th century to study. The imperfections of the calf skin, not cat, but cat skin vellum of this 1280 AD copy by a German scribe of the 2nd century book, De Bello Judaica, of the Jewish wars, particularly inspired us. We spent many hours studying the raw beauty of the parchment and its text. Meantime, there are 6 giant kilns sitting there over a 2-week period of the 5 weeks, and we haven't touched them. I started thinking, I've got to make something. And then I thought, no, I'll make what I made before leaving home. I need to keep doing this. So, and we had the incredible, again, another cocoon. Cocoons are really important. Please give yourself lots of them. One calf skin yields 3 pages of vellum. So this book was about 100 pages. There was another, the etymological, that was about 300 pages. But of course, everything was used from the calf. The skin just wasn't taken and used. But it was. This is a picture of the etymological. That's a 6th century book that was copied by monks in Paris. And look at the difference in the vellum. This is like butter. They were much better artisans in Paris than they were in this particular part of Germany. But what intrigued us were the wounded pages. That's what held our interest, including one that was supposed to be sewn. It was like we were in that moment. Time just disappeared. You can see where they're preparing it for the stitching, and someone forgot in 1280. We fell in love with the texture of the text. Now, the word text comes from texere, which means to weave. So does the word texture and textile. By the way, I have a theory that our first rhythm, our first language, the really first language we have is the beating of our mother's heart. It's all gurgles and noises aside from that. And then there's a particular rhythm that forms us. The second language that we know is the touch of our mother's skin. And that's texture. And that language comes out of that. And that weaving is one of our basic languages. And that text comes out of weaving. The scroll itself is like a tapestry loom. The book is very different than that, but that's another whole subject. I've thought a great deal about it because I was an English major. Time disappeared as we looked at a repair that was still waiting to happen almost 1,000 years later. Isn't that gorgeous, the way that they did the lettering around the repair? Another ritual evolved. I would, on my way to the studio, spend time each day at the museum, breathing in two particular pieces by František Disner, a blue vessel and a yellow one. Their simplicity, patience, skill, and silence spoke deeply. So every day I'd stop there first before I went to meet Michael. And these tektites displayed at the museum spoke eloquently too. Formed unintentionally by powerful natural forces, they spoke to something archetypal just as Wisner's work did. As Carl Jung, the great psychologist, said, the problem with Western culture is that we think matter is dead. Matter became very alive for us. We slowed down and became more present. After a couple of weeks, we unpacked the glass sheets from Bullseye. We noticed their beautiful chill marks. You've all seen those, right? But this time, just like that stump at Pilchuck, we noticed them. We were hesitant to even do anything with the sheets because those chill marks were so beautiful. And if we think about the glass that comes from Bullseye, you have approximately 130 to 140 people, all artists in their own way, who are making a work of art that we then take and turn into other works of art. So one morning, Michael came in from his house on the lake, and he said he had a thought as he awoke. Why not cast the sheets of glass and to make that into a mold, to capture that texture? In other words, to honor the work that went into making those sheets of glass. I thought that was just a great idea. But here was the vellum speaking through us. We would not have noticed that, I think, and used it if we had not spent all that time with that incredible vellum. Our collaboration was so easy. Michael would have a thought, I'd have a thought, great idea, not a great idea. We would honor this handmade surface by casting it, not just to use the glass to make something else, but to honor the process, the creators of the process, and all those who helped make this glass, which means everyone at Bullseye. So we laid out 3 pieces, and we captured children and made them work for us. Now, this little boy was sitting outside. He was so bored. He was standing there waiting for his mother and his dad, and so I went out and I just asked him, how good are you at rolling snakes? And he said, I'm very, very good. I said, terrific. And so he did. And we turned the snakes into walls. June and Tate, 2 of Michael's students from Rochester Institute of Technology, came to help. spontaneously, so we had them flame work glass replicas of the Thorns. And then a week later, I suggested that we use the Thorns to divine words in De Bello Judaico. Perhaps these words could help lead us. One of the words was Stella, for star. Later, a blizzard was named, the blizzard's name was Stella. 3 weeks later, when the blizzard came, I heard the name on the radio. It said, Stella will be blowing in. I thought, be careful what you do with divination. So I studied 4 years of Latin, but this Latin was very tricky, very hard for me to read. There's a lot of contraction in medieval Latin. And this is what the residency was like. Carol White is the president of the Corning Museum of Glass. And we were talking with one of the librarians, and we said, God, it'd be great to have someone who could read medieval Latin. She said, well, whoops, I think I just lost something, sorry. She said, well, it's interesting. She said, Beth said, I think that Carol's husband is a retired professor of medieval Latin. So we pulled Stephen in, and he helped us translate the sections that we pointed to. We also used the Thorns to mark where to place frit on the wax mold. So rather than saying, oh, this is in relationship to this, we let the Thorns decide the relationships. The work was making itself. We were following it. Then David Schnuckel, who is a master blower, works with Michael at RIT, volunteered to blow whatever we wanted. He worked for 5 days. And since we were dealing with medieval manuscripts and these very primal thorns, we decided that we'd work with images from Bosch's The Garden of Earthly Delights. These shapes are primal, disturbing, and mysterious, and they seem to hold the unconscious. Not unlike a tree that makes thorns when under stress. So these are some of the shapes, and I'll show you what happened. He worked with the white shape, a part water, part land creature. It became a vessel that could not be used. The tree man image in a scene of horrible destruction became a broken egg shape. So all the different shapes that we worked with, coming directly from this, I now have in my studio, and I'm waiting to see what might want to come from that. So alchemy continued, even though we didn't use any of these shapes in that particular residency. They'll find their place eventually. Meantime, Michael started blowing some even more primal shapes, coating them with powders from bullseye. These held the ancient and the earthy, like the tektites. Again, each shape was enough. This is what started happening. Everything was enough. We didn't have to make anything else. If we wanted to stop at that moment, it was fine. Meantime, time was really pressing, because what we did end up eventually doing, some of the pieces took 5 days to anneal. So, but we weren't worried about that. It didn't matter. What mattered was that it was enough. What we were doing each day was enough in itself. We didn't think about tomorrow. We weren't worried about what we would do with these pieces. We simply appreciated their beauty. Now, I've worked from process my whole life. Because I was not trained as an artist, because the unconscious overwhelmed me when I was younger, and I had to find a language to contain it. I've always worked from process. This was different. This was beyond that. And it was reinforced by 2 people working together this way. Once we discussed our process with Jane Cook, the chief scientist of the museum. We mentioned plumbing the depths in the ocean or a river. This is Jane's writing. PB. She immediately wrote on a whiteboard the symbol for lead, PB, which comes from lead being used as a plumb. We looked at ancient plumb forms. Michael blew some when Steve White spoke about taking soundings from different passages for his translations. Michael and I looked at each other. There was the title of our work, Soundings, when we got to it. And then notice the white form here. That's a very special form. We had done all these black forms, and we needed white billets, and we didn't have them. So we took the glass that we had molded, made molds from, and we cut them up, and we turned the bullseye plate glass, the big glass sheets, we turned them, by heating them, we turned them into billets, which is fascinating. They reacted very, very differently than other kind of billets that David had worked with before. Very soft and wonderful. Two more students, Grace and Sue Young, joined us, and we set the shapes into our wax molds. Can you see how how integrated this process is? A slow, beautiful process of discovery. Each part of the unfolding process was enough in itself. We simply stood in the present, experiencing the beauty of the moment. It was like standing with divination and being part of it. To level our molds, we poured sand into the kilns. Michael unconsciously referenced the Dogon divination structure. This mold has pieces of black frit embedded where the thorns had pointed. We poured black powder, 0-100, that wonderful black, into the molds. And we worked out firing schedules. Michael did, really. And though Michael is a master at this, we were moving quickly at this point and having to guess, though an educated guess on his part at times. So the schedules kept changing, because sometimes we'd open the kiln and this is what we'd see. And he said, well, maybe if we fire for 2 more hours at this and this, and sure enough, it worked. When the molds broke during firing, we took great delight in the beauty, and we put them back together so that they would have a voice in the next firing, so the breakage would have a voice in the next firing. Ideas were flowing, and we were running out of time. When we ran out of black, the 0-100, Harry, and also some glass that we had in black, Harry, who runs the facility at Corning, gifted us with years of scraps he had saved at the studio. He brought in boxes of exactly the black that we need. He said, I've been waiting for somebody to need this. We felt grateful and rich beyond rich. Here is a mold filled with some of the scrap. Here's one of the finished pieces. Very different than Michael's work and very different than my work. They're 20 by 35 inches. The frits are placed where the thorns lay, as you saw, and the cracks in the molds made their voice heard. These are very difficult to photograph. They are source pieces. We will begin from them. Do you notice how in the center between the square and the circle there is a crack that occurred that looks just like one of the thorns? And here's some of the white pieces being used. The ones that were made with the billets made from the bullseye glass. So Lian Uesato, who was one of the conservationists, came to visit on the next to last day. We had just pulled out a piece where we had purposefully used 2 kinds of glass to see what would happen. As Jane Cook says, it was glass on glass violence. Lian, while living in Hawaii, had done much kitasugi, the repair with the gold enamel of ceramics, and in that, the repair enhances the beauty of the piece. So Michael jokingly said, how would you like to repair that one? And Leanne's eyes brightened, and I asked, would you like to repair it, Leanne? And she said, I'd love to. And I said, then I have 2 requests. The first is that you use your own artistry, because she's an artist also. And I said, take the woundedness of the piece and make it more powerful than it could have been if it had been perfect in the first place. Don't deny the woundedness. Secondly, please use some of the gold colors somewhere on it. So Michael and I wrote a statement so that she could convince the other conservators. And she took the statement, and the piece now has a number. And those are some of the parts in the little containers. And it's waiting for transformation. It's waiting for its metamorphosis. We used all of Corning, unsuspecting visitors, wonderful students, the conservation lab, the library, the museum, the studios, the scientific community, the landscape. We used flame working, kiln firing, blowing. We went there not expecting, having no idea what we're going to do. We used all of it. We felt for over a month what it is to stand in the divine and the mundane. We felt that in our bodies. And that is what was most important to take back to our studios, that knowledge of trusting what we absolutely did not know. I'll repeat that, because I think it's so important. And that is what was most important to take back to our studios, that knowledge of trusting what we absolutely did not know. We experienced that what we gaze upon gazes back. In other words, that matter is alive, that we are in a dialogue with all that surrounds us, from the macrocosm of the universe to the microcosm of an ant carrying a grain of sand, sand that might eventually become glass. We felt the web quivering. We have no idea what might grow out of our residency. We shall continue taking soundings. And I hope that you use these next days to better know what transformation means to you, what healing means to you, where you are placed at this time in this world with your ability to do art. Try to take quiet time to think about this, to make your own soundings within your internal universe. Thank you. Questions? Are there any questions? Thank you for listening so closely. I appreciate it.
Do you want to just go read it?
Should I just read it?
Yeah,
Like,
just go ahead.
The sun brought to earth sounds a lot like the S-O-N brought to earth. Is that intentional? No, it's not. But I feel it's very interesting. When I came back from Corning, rather than working with glass immediately, I started working with fiber. I had an experience in New York City. You know, finally it's all about story, isn't it? And it's how we connect with different stories. I had a group in my studio the other day, the Glass Alliance, and I said, I want you to look around my studio and ask me about the objects here, because each one of them is here for a reason. Artists don't have objects in their studios without a reason. So each one has a story behind it. And that's what I then did. I simply told them some of the stories. So after all this intense work, so deeply informed with glass of all kinds, I went down to New York City, and so this is a roundabout answer to this question. And I was walking up 8th Avenue. I stay with my cousin who lives on 22nd between 8th and 9th. And I was walking up 8th Avenue. It was really cold, cold March wind blowing. It hurt. And I heard a baby crying. And there was a woman with a beautiful black pram. Obviously, there was money. And the baby's cry was coming from this exquisite black pram. And the woman was dressed very elegantly, and she was bending over, and there was a cashmere cover that she was trying to protect the baby with a little more. And I said, may I help you, please? And at that moment, a man who was bent under a heavy load, a black plastic bag full, came across 8th Avenue through the traffic, and he heard the baby crying. And this was a man who's had a really hard life. You can see that. He had a gray beard. He was black. he had what he owned in his life in his pack. Years ago, I was deeply moved by a Black Salvation Army Santa. I spent an entire year painting this man, going through many iterations. So here was a man, again, coming with this bag. And he was stooped over like this, and he came around when he heard the baby, and I'm standing here, and he's turning around like this and starts to come over, and some young guy comes by and just clips him. And I'm sort of stunned. And I look at the mother, and she's scared. Here's a street person, her baby, the whole thing. And I think, no way will I hurt this man. He's been hurt too much in his life. So I put my hand on his shoulder, and I said, you really like babies, don't you? And he smiled. He had like 3 teeth in his mouth. And he looked, and he said, I love their purity. And my heart just, and then he disappeared. So a week later, I'm back home in New Mexico, and I have a dream of a baby in a christening gown. So I've started sewing christening gowns. I hope that answers the son question. I happen to be Jewish. Barnett Newman was Jewish. He painted the 14 Stations of the Cross. I think there are some things that are archetypical, that are for each of us. And that Santa, that man, gave me such a profound, the mother didn't hear it, she was too scared. He gave me a gift that I then had to honor by doing these extremely simple gowns. Now I'm starting to do them in glass. So it's not intentional, it's unintentional, but it's what connects us all, I think. You see, the approach to your work is so rich and layered, and this is so important to making art. Do you know why most art programs don't address these skills? Do any of you have any ideas on that? I haven't been through art programs. So I don't know why. I do know that what happened to mine is I had to survive. And if I didn't do art, can we turn up the lights so I can see people in answering the questions? It's funny to answer questions and not be able to see you. Let's see. Good. Thank you. You can sort of see it. For me, it was a way to put my world together. Now, I don't know if it's that for everybody. That's what it was for me. And so my art has always come deeply from that need of healing. I don't think art schools are set up with that in mind. And perhaps there should be more of that. I suspect that there should be a lot more. Many times, I've taught a great deal. And I've worked with people who have gone through art school programs. And it's really hard for them to break out of certain things. And they talk about that, how hard it is for them. I'm not putting that on them. That's not what I'm thinking. I'm simply working with them and how strictured they feel. I think it's very important for programs to expand into thinking about the psychological, the emotional, about what we all connect with deeply. My husband and I are working on a novel, and from a dream that he had, and one of the characters in the contemporary part of the novel is an art professor at UNM named Eva Stein. And I'm doing a syllabus for her that addresses that way of approaching perception. Because we're really talking about perception, about personal healing. And it's not self-indulgent. I don't know why these things get called these words. We need a new use of our language. I was talking to a mediator the other day, and someone used the word diversity, and I said, that word separates. It doesn't pull us together. It's become a bomb that you drop in a room to separate people. I said, what word would you use instead of diversity when you talk to two groups who are here and here? And she thought for a minute, and she said, I guess I would ask the people, are there any voices that need to be here that aren't here? Are there any other voices we need to invite into this room to understand better what we're talking about? And it was like, can relax with that word. Of course, that word will become tainted in time, and then other words. When I think about art, that it's really important that we find the proper language to talk about what we're looking for. So can I hear from some of you what your words are? Can we just start here? That word that you spoke that holds what you want to happen.
My word was Dharma.
Dharma? Hope? What?
I have the same word like you.
Hope? How many people had hope? Oh, interesting. What other words? Shout them out, please.
Love.
What? Love?
Courage.
Courage?
Honesty.
Honesty? Acceptance? Interesting. Trust?
Nymph.
What?
Nymph.
Nymph?
Yeah.
N-Y-M-T-H? Nymph. It sounds a little like Monty Python. I was having trouble at first.
It's an immature insect. As an immature insect.
An image or insect?
Immature.
Oh yes. Okay, that kind of nymph. I thought you meant fairy nymph. That's great. That's great. That's wonderful. Like a dragonfly, like a nymph. That's beautiful. Thank you. See, language is tricky. Thank you. What else? What other words? Depth.
Go deeper.
Depth. Release. Say it again. Joy. Passion. Edges. Knit. Interesting. When a word like knit comes up, I think it's really important to actually do it, because so much of our intelligence lies right here. I really would have done a different exercise with you, one where you actually used your hands, because what I've noticed teaching is that we have this, we have this, we have these, and the reason we have this is these. Without that opposable thumb, we'd be climbing the trees. Or making our nest in this is, I think, why our brain became so big. It was the language between these that got developed.
What exercise would you have us do?
I would have had you holding clay and holding it through the entire talk. But it would seem just a bit much with so many of us. I didn't want to make it too disruptive. But clay, yes. And when you go home, when you think about these words and you're at home, if you have any clay or even mud, do something with your hands while you're thinking about them. You'll be surprised, I think. Because finally what art's about is surprising ourselves, isn't it? In another way, that we never know quite what's going to happen, no matter how adept we become. See, with Michael had the knowledge of 40 years of doing glass. I've only been doing glass for 5 years. I don't have that kind of knowledge. And I always worked with the simple. When I was a tapestry weaver, I never went onto a harness loom. I learned harness loom weaving, but it didn't hold my interest. The simpler the material, the way the material can be used, the happier I am. So in terms of kiln work, I use powders, and I sift, and I do other things with powders. I mix colors. Everybody's done the techniques that I know. Michael was extremely knowledgeable in technique. What Michael wanted from me was what I know about working in the deep unconscious. And over the years, learning how to contain it. We all have a journey, the amount of space that we cover in a day. And as I said, space and time in our journey became very, very flexible. So any other questions? And I hope you're going to talk about your words with each other and look at the words at the end of the conference and see what happened around that word for you. Let it be a kind of place on the web that can quiver. I'll quickly mention, I went to see Stanley Kunitz's garden. I was in Cape Cod a couple of weeks ago. Our neighbors have a place there, and they invited us. Oh no, it's those Tuwaletstiwas sponging off, off the cousins and everybody again. We're lucky we have friends who have places and nice places. And I got to see Stanley Kunitz's garden. He gardened till he was 100 years old. He was stooped like this when he was finishing gardening. And it's really small. It's a small Cape Cod backyard. But the poetry that came out of his experience of that garden is as big as the universe. Thank you.